that maybe 25 years ago or so, I got a letter from this young scholar with a lot of hair at that time, so, saying that he's coming to Israel to research a totally new topic for him. His field is architectural history of vernacular architecture. He's written some books on the topic, but he decided to enter this field of Jewish architecture and discover what's going on in Poland, which I think your family is coming from, yeah? Okay, so that's was of course interesting. So we met, and this was the beginning of some affair that lasts many years. And I think the combination was the publication of your book, which really, I think, changed the field. Everybody is using it, and they're mentioning it all the time and referring to it, whether even they disagree with you and so on. I just want to mention another thing. 2 weeks ago, just sitting at home and listening to the radio, Reshet Aleph, there was a lecture of Professor Zev Gris from Ben-Gurion University, and he was interviewed and spoke about this, one of his fields of research, which is the reception of the Hebrew book, how printed books were received in the Jewish society from the 16th century and on. And he used your book to say, here is an example. We needed, he said, this American scholar to come to Israel and to show us how texts were used and understood and distributed, and how the book became, let's say, written on the walls of the synagogues. So he gave your example, something that we should all read your book because of that. So that was very nice to hear this connection. Okay, so the topic of Professor Hubka is the tent and the tabernacle symbolism in the wall paintings of Polish synagogues.
Thank you, Shalom. Thank you, Vladimir. It's an honor to be here. During the 17th and 18th centuries, before the advent of the Haskalah and Hasidic movements, Jewish communities from the small towns or shtetls of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth used the imagery of tents in the wall paintings throughout the prayer halls of their wooden synagogues. My paper today identifies these tent images and attempts to link them to the tent of the tabernacle as the primary source of inspiration. Because of time constraints, I will focus primarily on the Gevorshjet Synagogue, shown here, although similar imagery exists in other wooden and masonry synagogues and represents, I believe, wide institutional and rabbinical support for the importance of both tent and tent of the tabernacle imagery. To begin, the paintings from the Gevorshjet Synagogue contain multiple tent of the tabernacle references and symbolism, including the following features. 1. The paintings on the centers of 3 of the synagogue's 4 walls show the holy vessels of the tabernacle. The menorah, showbread staples, the ark, plus the tabernacle's entrance in their correct ritual locations as specified in Exodus 25. So, for example, here in Gevorshjet is the menorah on the southern wall as specified, God's specifications. And here in Yabonov Synagogue is the menorah in a drawing of it. And I just want to emphasize this, that these aren't just, there's a menorah on the southern wall. This is central to the artistic development of a lot of synagogues. I think there's probably about 7 that we know that have this location. 2. Above the synagogue's ark were painted replicas of the ark's curtains and valance or hoshet. We've seen a lot of these in this same symbolic orientation that we have here. It doesn't have to be the tabernacle, just a valance over it, but I think we can look to the tabernacle. 3. The wall and ceiling paintings contain prayers and ethical expressions, some with reference to the tent of the tabernacle, and I don't have time to identify these references, which I cite in my book. I could show you them on the Gevorgya Synagogue. 4. Dominating the lower walls of the synagogue were frame painted prayers in 10 large tablet-shaped panels, approximately 5 feet wide and 10 feet high, that I believe are related to the 10 tapestries of the tabernacle as cited in Exodus 26:1. In the synagogues that we know in the Gevorgya region, consistently they are these 10 monster tablets. I mean, again, this isn't just a bunch of prayers that are lying on the wall. It's 10. It's 10 of these tablets over and over again. Could these be the 10 tapestries of the tabernacle? Is what I would ask you. Today, I would like to explore the various motivations that may have prompted this unity of painting and architecture and the symbolic expression of tents, and particularly the tent of the tabernacle at the Gevorgya Synagogue. The construction of the Gevorgya Synagogue was probably begun during the middle of the 17th century, and its remodeling, which we'll see shortly, lasted into the middle of the 18th century. This synagogue's architecture combined ancient Eastern European vernacular, log and frame construction systems, and an architectural vocabulary derived from Polish manor houses and Baroque churches. Although appearing exotic today, the synagogue's architectural style and construction systems, like other wooden synagogues, closely follow the standard forms and techniques of Polish civic and church buildings. So here we see the Hubka synagogue, and we see a fairly standard Polish inner tavern of the period. They're the same architectural expression. The Jews are not inventing new architecture for their synagogue, nor could they, being excluded from building trades and things like that. But synagogues like the Gevorgyas were simultaneously unique structures, different from other types of buildings in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and demonstrate a particularly distinctive Polish wooden synagogue architecture. With regard to this distinctiveness, it is important to recognize that no other pre-19th century diaspora community worldwide, elite or vernacular, wooden or masonry, achieved such a distinctively Jewish architectural expression as the wooden synagogues of the Polish Commonwealth. That's an architectural critique. And you can disagree with that. What is significant about the Gevorgya Synagogue construction for this analysis is the well-documented interior remodeling completed in 1731 that transformed its prayer hall by the removal of its original flat wooden ceiling and the building of a pyramidal cupola, into the space of the original attic. The new ceiling produced a dramatic tent-like vaulted canopy above the prayer hall. So this flat wooden ceiling was taken off, and then this projection, which shows here and here, was inserted into that ceiling at this 1729 to 231. Although no documentation for the design development has survived, there are many reasons to suppose that the builders, painters, and community leaders intended the new vaulted cupola of the Gevorgya Synagogue to represent a monumental tent, and the most widely known were Ottoman tents, particularly the undulating form of a pyramidal Ottoman imperial tent. The appropriateness of an oriental tent imagery for a synagogue may seem surprising at first, but there were several important factors that gave Ottoman tents significance to an 18th century Polish-Jewish community in the southeastern borderlands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. These include such diverse factors as the significance of the Ottoman tent as a national symbol for both Poles and Jews following the defeat of Ottoman forces by King Jan Sobieski at the gates of Vienna in 1653, and the return of the captured Ottoman imperial tents to Poland. Celebrated in Polish culture up to the present, these tents became embedded within Polish national mythology, as well as the decorative arts and the textile traditions of their era. So here we see a very famous Polish painter, Mitieko. Here's the king over there, and here's his forces, and here's the tent, and here's one of the captured Sultan's tents that one of them that is being brought back to Poland. Two, the pyramidal, undulating, or double curving shape, OG curve, shape of these widely celebrated tents closely resembles the 8-sided undulating pyramidal ceiling of the Gevorget ceiling. So I'm making that connection between these two types of architectures. 3, the entire ceiling is covered with many painted tent features, including tent ropes, tent fabric stitching, and the scalloped drop-edged borders related to tents in general and Ottoman tents in particular. The rope, lots of architectural drawings have rope imagery, but this ceiling and others have this rope imagery. Tent borders, these are exterior borders, but there's an interior-exterior flip that's going on. And no one else has emphasized this, but there's a stitching motif here. I don't want to rate that too highly, but this is stuff that's stitched together in various ways. But other art historians may define that a little differently, but it looks to me like tent stitching, so we'll let it be there. The paintings contain specific Ottoman tent decorative patterns, such as the arabesque. I mean, the arabesque is a slam dunk Islamic motif, but used in Sephardic decorative development for hundreds of years. And so here we see the upper portions, it's shaded over here. The arabesque is right there, they're drawn over here. And here we see the Ottoman tent, but these are all the arabesque patterns in a similar kind of location. Anyway, Islamic, I say Islamic, but immediately I say Sephardic because of the overlapping of Sephardic and Islamic decorative motifs. 5, the maintenance of Sephardic decorative arts traditions in Polish communities, and particularly in the wooden synagogues. For example, the carpentry of the bima. I could talk about decorative arts here, but I like to focus on the bima, the construction of this bima. This, I would say, from Western architectural carpentry standards, is untranslatable. But if you look at the Islamic playbook of decorative motifs, I think you will find recurring this lantern up on top. So that comes right out of the Islamic motifs. And therefore, I think what we're looking at here is borrowing immensely from this Islamic Sephardic culture. 6, the dominance of Jewish merchants in the Polish textile and tent trade to the Ottoman lands and throughout the Middle East. So Lviv was a particular center of textile trade and the tent trade. And for some of you, I mean, I don't know if you're Israeli, you go, if you're from the army, you go with your friends to go use tents for military exercises. What we have in Poland is a long tradition of the Polish szlachta, the upper class, in hunting expedition, and particularly it's kind of a macho art of the Cossack. And throughout many centuries, we have a continuity of the Poles going to the countryside. And they are serviced by Jewish merchants, Jewish caretakers for the Polish magnates. Anyway, the Jews are deeply involved with this tent trade and this fabric trade with Ottoman lands. Related to Jewish travel and trade with Ottoman lands, it should be noted that the southeastern portions of the Polish Commonwealth, where Gevorgets and 90% of the major documented painted wooden synagogues were located, is closer to Istanbul than to the Rhineland centers of commerce and trade. It doesn't, for some of you, calculate that way, but this trade to Ottoman lands is extensive, and in Gevorgets and other places we have the wealthy male portions of the population traveling to the Middle East, and they're involved in this trade. Therefore, when we weigh all these factors together, we should not be too surprised that if an early modern Polish community wanted to represent the Bible's tent of the tabernacle, they would have referenced the finest tent that they knew, and that was an Ottoman tent. I would now like to speculate about the reasons why the synagogue builders and their Polish communities intended that these many tent references, specifically referred to the tent of the tabernacle. From the 16th through the 18th century, the imagery of the tabernacle, and to a lesser degree the temple, had received renewed emphasis within the liturgy of Ashkenazic Jewry. Simultaneously, in 3 centuries prior to the construction of the Dvorzhets Synagogue, the image of the tabernacle's tent had also become more closely associated with the rituals of Sabbath worship. In one particularly influential Sabbath image, the tabernacle's canopy sheltered the bride Shekinah in a sacred marriage ceremony. Although the association of the divine marriage with Sabbath worship reflected the contribution of elite scholars and Kabbalists over a long period, the Zohar's many prominent references to the tabernacle as a divine bridal canopy strongly reinforced the sacred marriage imagery for Ashkenazic Jewry during the 17th and 18th centuries. This broad reconceptualization of the Sabbath had evolved over many centuries, but was finally popularized within the daily liturgy of the early modern Polish communities by the influence of the Safavid Kabbalist Isaac Luria after about 1600. One significant result of this Lurianic influence was the widespread adoption of revised liturgical practices for the Friday evening service, Kabbalah Shabbat, overlaid with the unifying image of a divine marriage ceremony, as succinctly envisioned by the prayer Lahadodi. The historical development of this divine marriage imagery has been analyzed by various scholars, including Gershon Scholem, Moshe Dell, and Elliot Wolfson. My analysis has been particularly influenced by Wolfson's work and is distinctly articulated in Elliot K. Ginsberg's book, The Sabbath in Classical Kabbalah, where he emphasizes the intertwining of the images of God's sacred marriage occurring under a sacred tent. While the image of a sacred tent has a long history in Jewish symbolism and worship, one of the most universally adopted tent symbols, the four-posted wedding hupka, was introduced into the marriage rituals of Ashkenazic communities during the same period that the traditions of Kabbalah Shabbat, with its imagery of a sacred marriage ceremony, came to be associated with the Sabbath. In other words, later than is usually understood. Therefore, the simultaneous development of the chuppah, the tent canopy for Jewish marriage, and the Dvorzhets Synagogue cupola, the tabernacle's tent for God's sacred marriage, provides, I believe, an underlying motivation and rationale for the meaning of the Dvorzhets Synagogue remodeling. Another way of reinforcing this critical linkage between the tabernacle's tent with the design of the cupola at Dvorzhets through the imagery of the divine marriage is summarized by Lahadodi. The spread of Lahadodi, composed in the middle of the 16th century, first published in 1584 or 1599, depending on who you read, but only popularly recited in Polish communities after the middle of the 17th century, closely parallels the spread of tent-like cupolas in Polish synagogues. Here you have Lahadodi on the western wall as we turn prayer. This is big. Now here's a 6-foot. There's no people in this, but so here's a 6-foot person. And so this isn't Lahadodi isn't hiding in a small little thing. This is a monster advertisement for Lahadodi in the back of the synagogue. While the image of the sacred tent has a long history in Jewish symbolism and worship, one of the most universally accepted tent symbols, the four corners. I'm sorry. I really lost it. Although I am unable to precisely document this liturgical and architectural connection, I believe the same motivations that inspired the sacred marriage allusions in Lahadodi also inspired tabernacle marriage tent imagery underlying Dvorzhets ceiling remodeling. Therefore, I hypothesize that the tent-like shape of the Dvorzhets interior, embedded with tent and tabernacle imagery, might have risen, as the Zohar so strongly recommends, and as Lahadodi so vividly emphasizes, to celebrate a divine wedding ceremony. In summary, although you may or may not agree with all my tabernacle explanations, I think that many art and architectural historians will generally agree that the wooden synagogues and their elaborate ceiling paintings are directly or indirectly related to tents, and particularly Oriental Ottoman tents and that these forms were referenced or copied to enhance and intensify the visual and experiential qualities of worship within their wooden synagogue prayer halls. Finally, although I have not emphasized the similarities to other wooden synagogues, the dramatic cupola and elaborate paintings of the Dvorzhets Synagogue were not unusual, but were typical accompaniments to worship in the small towns of 17th and 18th century Eastern Poland. Although the liturgical implications remain subject to multiple interpretations, the art and architecture of the Dvorzhets Synagogue were dominantly representative of the popular mainstream culture of 17th and 18th century Ashkenazic Jewry that extended over a vast area of Eastern Europe, mainstream culture. It has been my intention to highlight the role that Jewish liturgy and literary sources played in the creation of the art and architecture of the wooden synagogues. Without underestimating the central role of non-Jewish, Eastern European regional art and architectural sources, I have emphasized the significant role that Jewish liturgical ideas had in shaping the individuality and distinctiveness of the wooden synagogues like the Dvorzhets. When this crucial contribution of Jewish sources is fully recognized, wooden synagogues like the Dvorzhets can finally be appreciated as the powerful original expression of their Polish Jewish communities, and perhaps as some of the most original expressions of Jewish liturgical art and architecture ever created. I emphasize the idea of Jewish liturgical art. This isn't new on earth or anything like that, but through a conference like this, we can say Jewish art. And I'm a cultural historian, and this must be placed within the context, I would say, of Judaism. We can interpret rabbits all the time, as we know, and all that. But then I think the importance is to create the context of interpretation of Jewish rabbits, and particularly, what did the congregation of Dvorzhets understand the rabbits at the time of production? So this is the cultural idea of the time and place of interpretation. I mentioned rabbit also because in Dvorzhets there are also rabbits in the decorative friezes that are there too, and these are rabbits that are part of an ornamental tradition and they don't have particular meaning. But even those rabbits, I would say, even if it's framing kind of a device around the prayer, the interpretation, I think, has to do with the prayer itself, and then we can interpret the animals, I think, within a larger context. Thank you very much.
We should add another chapter. Questions?
I just wanted to mention, you can see on this side on the right, but it's throughout the synagogue you have strips of ikat of the Bukharan style, very colorful silk weave that is very striking. Above above that, you see it? Oh, okay. Where? Those strips. There are many of the pictures, I think that's a proof of the merchant class and the textiles. No?
Got a lot of arguments about this one over here. There's we did the painting at the Polish Museum, and you can call it the ziggurat motif. In Polish folk art, that motif occurs over and over again. It's like a Navajo blanket motif and all that. So anyway, it's out there in a lot of forms over there. So different people can argue. It's not quite clear what that is, and so is it stretched out or uniform? I originally thought it's the 50 links in the tabernacle, because that's the architectural band around the whole thing that has to work. Various interpretations here.
But I didn't have. I'm sorry. My question is different. My question, I would very much appreciate if you could explain what the uniqueness is of the architecture of the Jewish synagogue. If that, in architectural terms, that would be very.
During the 17th, 18th century, travelers from all different countries always instantly understood Jewish architecture. So it was unique. It stood out as a unique form, even though, as I would, by architectural, I can point to all the pieces of wood that are basically part of that. They reached a synthesis of visual expressionism. It's hard because it did this in the shtetls. Did the Jews hide in the shtetl, this is architecture that punches out, that is absolutely distinctively Jewish in its era. And so I think I would then point to, if I go back to that slide that I had, the dominant forms of Polish architecture and how these buildings, although made of wood and cheese and all that, looked incredibly different. And then we'd have to say, well, how different and all that. I think we can make the case that they stood out. And travelers always recognize the Jewish architecture, so that stands out in a way that this isn't hiding architecture or blending in or something like that. It's very aggressive. Forceful.
Yes, speak. I have a comment and I have a question. So the comment is, in the Hope Synagogue,
Could you speak up, please?
yes, in the whole synagogue it's written on the eastern wall, verse, then he spread the tent over the tabernacle and put the covering over. So it does say very clearly something about the tabernacle, and it also, it's not inside a frame. It's inside. It's interrupted. The letters are interrupted by the floral decoration and by ropes. So there in the Hope Synagogue, it is clear that there is something with
But the shape of the Hope Synagogue is not over the tent.
No, it's not. But the idea is the same idea.
Conceptual tent, conceptual.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's.
it's a conceptual tent.
It's not quite clear the tabernacle's drapes of the tent structure and all that. God didn't specify everything exactly, so there's a lot of conceptual tent is what we're talking about here, and we have different. The Poles developed I say Poles, it's the Polish architectural builders, so with knowledgeable Jewish clients, developed these shapes of this. Hodorov develops what I would call the standardized barrel vault with hip ends. Dvořák is not, I think, an early experimentation, but I think in the later experimentation you have this standardized Hodorov type of tent and all of that. That for various reasons seemed to be, and it was reproduced over and over. Dvořák is unique in earliness and in its square shape. The floor plan is rectangular in most of the other synagogues.
Can I ask?
Wait, Rina.
Okay. The idea of the Lechadogi in the Polish synagogue, it looks, it works. Okay, with your ideas, but the question is this prayer? Does it appear in other synagogues? Because Dvořák didn't invent mythology of himself.
So we need someone who looks at every prayer in every synagogue that we know. I think this is the only one that I know specifically.
I
So good.
Yes. Lechadogi appears okay in the Tikochin synagogue, but not in the western wall, in the eastern wall. That's the only two Lechadogi that we know now. But I want to add that the idea of Shabbat on the western wall of the synagogue, it repeats also in the Boskovice synagogue, where we see the menorah and the shulchan and the word Shabbat on the western wall. And this is again something from the Zohar and the Kabbalah, and I will not go into it now.
We just combined there's wooden and masonry synagogues at this point.
Yeah, but the sizes, because the prayer was not in the prayer books. So
Absolutely not.
yeah, that's why they needed it in a big size so they could read it.
And it's a new prayer.
Yeah.
That's the relative to this.
Rina.
Thank you. I found your suggestion convincing. I would like just to expand the perspective of your suggestion and relate to the origin of the idea in Judaism. The idea that the tabernacle should serve as a model for the synagogue versus the temple started with Philo. In this way, Philo wanted to justify the holiness of the synagogue in the diaspora and to explain why the Shekhinah resides everywhere and not only in the temple in Jerusalem. And, if we use the modern terms, Smith, but in this way he tries to convince that the Shekhinah doesn't dwell, he wanted to present this model of locative versus utopian holy places. And one should know that also from late antiquity, churches related to the tabernacle as a model for the church. And one can see that also in the decoration of churches. For example, in the church of the Red Monastery in Soag, dated to the 5th century, and one can read about that in the recent book written by Elizabeth Ballman, published at Yale University Press a few months ago.
For thousands of years, Jews have dialogued with themselves about should the synagogue be based on the temple, based on the tabernacle, and we can see it coming and going. And I read this with the people who have read about the synagogue, the development of the synagogue. And so you'll see different eras of sometimes borrowing simultaneously, sometimes rejecting one and finding the other. It seems to me during this period, with Hubka and others, we have a new environment in which the tabernacle is emphasized. So is that, I'm trying to say that I recognize temple symbolism throughout, but it waxes and wanes in different countries and different architects and all that. Maybe Sergio.
Okay, two more questions, David and Sam.
It's not a question. This kind of very, very intense ornamentation of the wall, it's not very typical to synagogues. It's typical to this kind of synagogues, and it reminds fabric ornamentation. So it can be part of the idea of the tent, of the Ottoman tent, that the way of filling the space with these ornaments.
Absolutely. Well, the tabernacle's fabric, I think, are one of the basis of every visitor went into the wooden synagogue said, looks like a Turkish carpet. Words to those effect. But I would hesitate to say we don't know a whole lot about synagogues from after about 5 AD or whatever to the present. I mean, to the Polish synagogues. And so in many countries, my guess is that we have a whole lot more decoration than you'd think about. We have so little information. Let's not. But in the Polish Commonwealth, we see synagogues that are vastly decorated. So maybe that went back a long, long way to the Rhineland and other places. So we don't know. And my guess is your guess too. Good luck.
Okay, Sam.
Just a comment and a question to link Tom's wonderful interpretation to two other tent types where the question is still out. One is in the Ottoman lands, beginning about the same time that Al-Khalidi begins, but really even a little bit earlier, and possibly going back to Spain, we have the development, the widespread use of the four-column or four-support teva with a domical canopy, which also relates to Byzantine forms and early Christian forms. I know all of that, but it's interesting that we see it spreading, particularly in the late 18th, early 19th century, but it's another kind of tent to be explored. Secondly, in my work with some 20th century synagogues, I see the widespread, well not widespread, but I can think of several instances of the inclusion of the Matovu inscription in the synagogue, which people would recite coming in, referring not to these tents, but to the tent, not to the tabernacle, but to the tents of Jacob. And that's a new model for a diaspora synagogue. I do have a general question. If anyone knows the earlier dates or earlier instances of the inclusion of the Matovu prayer, or even the first expression from Numbers, just the first line, in a synagogue inscription, I'd love to know. So,
come.
אני צריכה להיזכר, זה לא כל כך פשוט. I have to think about it.
I have some from around the beginning of the 20th century, but not earlier.
In the Ashkenazi custom is to turn towards west for saying Boi Beshalom, not in the Sephardi. So it may be the reason that the Shabbat is on the western wall is for this reason.
I wonder if Farmer Wright saw this thing when we do it. Interesting. Okay, thank you so much.